under management. A lot of it is the wealth of nonprofits. I do know from work such as scholars like Greta Krippner, who we were discussing earlier, that the combined revenues of nonprofit corporations, right, from financial investments of endowment, but also other admissible revenues, like the YMCA selling gym memberships, the revenues generated by nonprofit medical systems such as the University of Chicago, those revenues now dwarf, right? I mean, they absolutely dwarf U.S. corporate manufacturing profits, right? Okay, so it was supposed to be, like the way it's set up, it was supposed to be income from, say, the Carnegie Steel Company, redistributed through the Carnegie Foundation. Now in a post-industrial finance and service-oriented economy, the nonprofit side actually seems to be generating more revenue than the industrial side. That construction, in my opinion, just doesn't make sense in a post-industrial economy in which financialization is a central aspect. So I think here we have an example of kind of facts on the ground, getting out in front of a kind of regulatory, legal, and political regime with which to organize and manage it. Indeed, with the passing of an industrial-focused economy, the for-profit, nonprofit boundary since the 1980s has blurred. And scholars have written about this in many different ways. And so there's many different ways to tackle this topic. On the one hand, clearly, as I mentioned, nonprofit revenues have become more crucial for capitalist profit making than ever before. I mentioned BlackRock and other private equity funds like BlackRock are very much involved in that game. It's also true as profit-seeking capital has abandoned largely factories and has sought profits in what were putatively nonprofit sectors, such as healthcare. So over the past decades, many nonprofit corporations simply converted to for-profit corporations to get involved in this new game of asset price appreciation. And I've studied this a little bit. I'll just mention a few kind of episodes that were important. It sort of starts in the 1980s with changes to the tax regime then, which I don't have time to go into, but we could talk about if you like. But the 1990s is when you really see for-profit start to get into the healthcare sector. 1996, a kind of important moment, this is very early days, a large nonprofit health insurer, Blue Cross of California, converted to the for-profit WellPoint Health Network. So it becomes a for-profit essentially kind of overnight. Or you get very complex networks of collaboration between nonprofits and for-profits. Another case that I've written about in my research was the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine, which is a Catholic charity that originally operated in Cleveland under an 1851 corporate charter that looked a lot like Tom Scott's railroading charter, except it was for healthcare charity as opposed to for railroading. In the 20th century, the Sisters of Charity founded a number of nonprofit hospitals in Cleveland that were dependent upon public funds coming out of the welfare state. When those funds dried up during the early 1990s, the sisters entered into a joint venture with Columbia HC Healthcare Corporation, HCA, which is a for-profit. And the way they do it is they charter a new corporate intermediary. This is part of the legal history of how the for-profit, nonprofit boundary has blurred. And into that intermediary, the sisters relinquish their hospital's assets in return for a $200 million payment from Columbia HCA. And through that, Columbia acquired the right to manage the hospitals and generate taxable profits, while the sisters still maintain control over that intermediary's board. So that these transactions were very complicated, actually hard to parse through, but were kind of early and quite prescient of dynamics to come still to this day in the healthcare industry, in which for-profits want to get the assets of these nonprofits onto their balance sheets to leverage, to access more credit, to acquire more assets, and the logic goes round and round. Okay, let me conclude, and then we can have some time for question and answers if you like. So one possible, interpretation of all this is that since the 1980s, in the era of financialization, many once nonprofit corporations have embraced the logic of the market and have sacrificed their social and public purposes, succumbing to the profit-seeking logic of financialization. Now, in my opinion, that interpretation is correct, but to some extent, to some extent. And I think there are reasons to pause, and here I'd be very eager to hear your comments and insights and expertise on the topic. In the era of financialization, as many for-profit corporations were abandoning unprofitable industrial capital like pasta factories, their movement into nonprofit domains like healthcare can be interpreted perhaps as desperate just as much as triumphant. So another possible interpretation, which I'll present to you as a provocation, is that in a post-industrial era, the barrier between for-profit and nonprofit, like an old pasta factory, is crumbling, and maybe there's possibilities here worth considering. And perhaps the story of financialization, one day we'll look back on the same era and talk about the nonprofitization of the US economy. And I think it's worth pondering what that would look like. So thank you. I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? I guess you'll walk on.
Colleen.
Maybe I'll start us off as people are pondering. Yeah, you gave us a lot to think about. I have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to think of which one to ask first. I think I'll start with, when you had this, the binary began with the distinction of for-profit and not-for-profit. I thought it was very interesting that you said that at the same time, and of course it makes sense, that you also had the binary of egoism and altruism.
Right.
And of course we know about, the gendered notions of voluntary work, right? So, and at the time, even though I guess it was a chartered nonprofit in the 19th century, well up to 1965, right, or around that time, it was still called the voluntary sector, So I guess what I'm wondering is, you kind of noted that, but I wondered if there was more to say about that altruism ego binary. So just to elaborate on that. And then a question around the altruism side, even though it's always been attached to nonprofits, and so I was very interested to hear you say, yes, it was attached from the very beginning, that there should be public, kind of public interest to be a nonprofit. My understanding is that the state has never really held nonprofits accountable for what that public interest actually means. And so I wonder if that's your read on it as well, or am I missing something from the history?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, thank you for the questions. There's a lot more to say about the egoism, altruism binary. Maybe I'll try not to say too much. One thing I would kind of add here, maybe as some more background information. Oftentimes when historians of corporations tell the story I was telling, it's a declension narrative. So you have this world in the American Revolution where all corporations have a kind of public purpose. Isn't that a great, wonderful thing? Well, I think there's things to like about that regulatory regime, but the way I would characterize the era is one in which people were comfortable with public and private just being entangled, like in really complicated ways. And it's a nice idea. You have to go get a corporation, a charter every time you want to have a corporation. You have to show and demonstrate that it meets a public purpose. But a lot of times people just gave charters to their friends, or to themselves because they actually own stock in the corporation itself. So, there are moments, I think the late 19th century is a moment, and I think the post-World War II period is a moment, where people became very anxious to disentangle spheres and create rigid boundaries between them. The late 19th century moment, that period of liberalism, that kind of Victorian era, has this very moralized understanding. It's a very gendered understanding too, of the market needs to be here and nonprofits need to be here, the market needs to be here, the state needs to be here, the market needs to be here, the family needs to be here. And yet sort of that's when you get that binary. But then in practice, they always tend to blur and mix because that's just kind of what life is, like. The post-World War II moment, which you also kind of evoked, that's a kind of Cold War moment where the United States is very sort of intent to distinguish itself from totalitarianism, from the Soviet Union, and that's when you get this kind of ideological championing of civil society, or the creation, and this is Lester Solomon's work, right, of sort of very notion of a nonprofit sector, which comes from the post-World War II period. I guess the point here is to say that these distinctions strike me as ideological distinctions. They're very powerful distinctions ideologically, and as I showed, they do have legal and institutional effects. So the income tax code is one, but when it comes to actually practically regulating nonprofits on behalf of the public, that doesn't necessarily follow. And people in the room probably know more about this than I do, but it seems like the tax exemption is the way through which nonprofits are regulated. And it's not a very effective way to regulate nonprofits at all. And, thinking of the conversation Colleen and I were having earlier, another reason why nonprofits in the United States have not been that well regulated is the state really depends upon them to execute public goals and deliver public services. And so there's a kind of dependency of the state on the nonprofit sector, from the beginning in the late 19th century, that makes the state really think twice about exercising the regulatory powers that that do exist. Yeah. See some hands down here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. You've made a lot of really excellent points about financialization. One thing I'd be interested in, and I think there'll certainly some definite benefits, including redefining some human needs as opportunities for long-term investments, but also there's the other side to it, which many people in the human services are very concerned about, which is commodification, monetization of human services. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more on that kind of duality.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that it strikes me, right? I mean, one of the kind of major fault lines today, which occurs in the context of financialization, as you rightly say, when thinking about social service delivery, the future of the welfare state, is whether or not we want to invest, no pun intended, in a kind of politics of decommodification, or if actually we want to invest in a politics, something like the kind of politics of a sort of basic income, right? And actually you're going to give people money, right? You're going to give people kind of cash entitlements, and that's how we're going to reimagine and rebuild the welfare state. I suppose I think oftentimes that debate is too stark, like it's one or the other, and that isn't necessarily helpful. And I suppose the drift of the talk that I gave would be maybe to say two things. Well, one that I think is the kind of drift of the talk, which you rightly, I think, noted, but then let me kind of qualify it, given your question. I think there is a way in which decommodification as a project can kind of smack of a very 19th century Victorian discourse of any activity that is touched in any way by money, by markets, is morally suspect, right? And I think that's if that's one's politics, I think it's very hard because I think that is a pretty abstract ideological notion, and one needs to be much more specific and concrete in looking at how actual institutions and actual policies work than just saying that. And I think, as you said, maybe within financialization, we could think about ways, and this I do, believe strongly, that to not just kind of lodge a moral critique of financialization because it commodifies things that shouldn't be commodified, because it puts things in the market that shouldn't be put in the market, but think about ways in which financialization can be appropriated, right, towards other ends besides just profit making itself. So I think that's true, and I think that's important. With that said, I would definitely want to qualify that by saying there are some things that just should not be in the market, and should not be subject to the logics and necessities and pressures of the market, and healthcare is one of them. So in that respect, financialization, to the extent to which it can be made an instrument of a kind of higher, more absolute value, I think shouldn't be necessarily rejected out of hand. But we shouldn't confuse the kind of means, with the end. And that end itself, I think we shouldn't be thinking in market terms whatsoever. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank
Hi.
you. I'm thinking a lot about what you said about NYU being a real estate corporation, and I'm curious your thoughts on if it is just for a university like the University of Chicago to maintain its tax-exempt status.
So the question is it just the just finding ways to maintain the tax-exempt status?
Like, is it right? Is it moral? Do we have like
Got
other
it.
moral obligations
Got it.
at a university that owns so much real estate, and like
Yeah,
what
yeah.
that's done to be?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, every once in a while, some upstarts in the Massachusetts, state legislature will float a debate to strip Harvard of its nonprofit tax exemption using precisely the logic that you're suggesting, that look, like you're accumulating massive amounts of wealth, you're not paying taxes, it's a public purpose, but you're not meeting that criteria. And then, of course, Harvard, much like Tom Scott, probably, Harvard sends its people to the state legislature and this sort of bill goes away. I think they're right. I think they're right. I think that just to kind of lay out the meaning of the tax exemption for the University of Chicago, it's twofold. One, it's a tax exemption on any revenues it generates, but it also allows these universities to, speaking of financialization as an instrument, go to the bond market, right? So the state of Illinois says the University of Chicago, through a special vehicle, you can look it up, it is a nonprofit institution, can market its debt and not pay taxes on it. And people who invest in the University of Chicago's debt themselves get a tax benefit. And in my opinion, I think that should come with much more stringent public obligations of these institutions. I said one should not be nostalgic for that old era of special act, specific purpose, because a lot of it was corruption, people just giving charters to their friends. But I do think the notion of that regime, that corporations, all corporations, right, are given from the state legal privileges like limited liability, like perpetuity. The University of Chicago never dies, right? Like us, it lives forever. Or the kind of special tax privileges, that those are privileges granted by the state and should come with public obligations. We can debate what those public obligations are, but I think the bar there should be set much higher than it currently is. That's my opinion. I'm a historian, I'm not an expert, but that's my opinion.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time. I know you mentioned in the beginning of your lecture that you focus primarily on history.
Yeah.
And so my question might be a little bit outside of your typical wheelhouse.
Okay.
But I'm curious in consideration of the historical pattern you've uncovered with our economy,
Yeah.
going from industrialization to financialization.
Yep.
How do you believe that the information era and the misinformation era that we're currently in, how it may actually impact future patterns of our economy and how that may conflict potentially with a financialization era that's built around smoke and mirrors and adding value to things or amping up value to things that may not actually be there?
That's a really good question. And I think that this is probably the scariest narrative one could generate out of this history. How do social media companies, how do they make money? Do they build commodities and sell them on the market? No, right? They mine our personal data, which they turn into assets, which they then sell to corporations who want access to our preferences encoded in our personal data or predicted by our personal data for purposes of advertising and marketing. And that business has completely bled into information of all kinds, including news, including politics. It's been sort of swept in before anyone really realized it was happening. So I think that's a dimension of this story. I tried, because who wants to be depressed all the time? I tried to find some ambivalence and some sort of possibility to think about with respect to financialization, but this just looks bad to me. And I think we're maybe back to a certain kind of politics where certain hard lines need to be drawn, as opposed to a politics of thinking about how to most fruitfully combine and recombine things together. So it's a good point. Thank you for the question. See a hand in the back.
Thank you for your talk. So my question had to do with from my understanding, it seems that a lot of well-meaning nonprofits are still pressured into financializing themselves and interacting with a lot more of the financial sector than I guess a lot of nonprofits ideally want to. But do you think it's possible for a nonprofit to fully be separated from financialization or having to take advantage of the finance sector to be successful, and especially in healthcare? Do you think a nonprofit hospital would be successful without having to be excessively financialized?
So can you say more about the pressure? I'm just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess in my understanding, it seems like a lot of from your presentation, a lot of nonprofits take advantage of tax exempt status and stuff to generate wealth for their own organization, and I guess a lot of people on the board of nonprofits can also accumulate wealth from nonprofit tactics using financialization. So I was just wondering if it's possible to really separate nonprofits from I guess.
So yeah, I mean, I got it. I mean, I sort of a few responses. I mean, one is my work as a historian. I mean, I'm a historian, but I am highly influenced by Thorstein Veblen, who was an economist here at the University of Chicago in a very different era of University of Chicago economics. And my perspective on a lot of these issues is informed by a book that he wrote that probably got him fired, and then he ended up publishing it, later in his career, called The Higher Learning, where he basically, sort of tries to make this point that, look, you can't completely, a university is not a for-profit corporation. It has a different mission, The Higher Learning, but you can't fool yourself about what keeps the lights on, right? Who funds it and how that works. And so you are in a complicated, tense, fraught, ambiguous relationship between different spheres and domains. And it's probably better to kind of face that contradiction and wrestle with it than it is to, search for kind of purity. Because purity is never really a good thing, ever, in my view. So I think that's so the answer to your question is, well, no, it's probably not. But there's lots of different ways for that dependency and for that relationship to exist, and there's lots of different terms on which it can exist. And it seems to me there's kind of two, maybe three dimensions of it. One is just funding. So it seemed to me it would matter a lot whether or not you're being funded by the state or you're being funded by kind of philanthropic wealth. Second would be kind of ideological, and I think there's a kind of other history to the talk I gave that just wasn't there because, just wasn't, how we talk about the state and how we talk about the public and how we think about the public and its values and why it exists and why those values need to be maintained and reinvigorated from time to time and furthered. And then there's kind of like an institutional kind of part of it. I mean, I mentioned accounting practices, which you would think would be, for profit. But, what's happening to this university now? You have a board of trustees led by private equity people who are treating the university as if it's they're making us perform, even though we're a nonprofit, right? We have to produce budgets to perform as if we're a for-profit, even though we're not a for-profit. And so that's another kind of line of tension is what are the mechanisms through which different institutions should account for themselves, account for their own values, and account to others that fund them or somehow exist in relation to them. So, this is kind of when students turn in papers and say, well, it's complicated. Usually professors don't like that, oh, what kind of insight is that? But I think that's kind of what I'm sort of pressing towards. These are really complicated relationships, and it's hard to kind of talk about them in the abstract in a very general way, such as, classification 1, corporations not for profit, classifications 2, corporations for profit. I don't think that's a very helpful way to think about the kinds of issues that we're talking about and addressing.
We do.
Do we have time for any more questions, or are we at
There's
time?
a couple of online questions, but I want to field these first.
Yeah.
So for the example of the macaroni factory,
Yeah.
would the reasoning behind why NYU could not take the profits of macaroni factory is because it's outside its charter and then infringing on the macaroni industry?
Yeah, so there's two, it's not the charter, but it's well, I mean, I guess you're right. The charter is educational purpose. You have to have revenue coming back to the educational purpose. But, NYU is very clear, this macaroni funds our law school. We're not using it to go out and buy another, macaroni factory or buy a tire company or diversify into some other kind of for-profit sphere. So they met that criteria. But you're right, and actually this is an important clarification that I didn't underscore enough. There's kind of two justifications. One is that's an industrial for-profit making activity that we see as being outside the scope of a nonprofit. The second point is that the only people who sell NYU, this is probably true then, and it might not be true now, the only institution that sells t-shirts, purple t-shirts that says NYU on it is the NYU bookstore. So you're not in competition with anybody, right? This is something you're doing yourself. Whereas, macaroni, there's lots of macaroni companies, and because C.F. Mueller's doesn't have kind of pressure, right, necessarily, although, I mean, again, NYU was in serious financial hardship, and it needed to maximize the short-term profits of C.F. Mueller's macaroni all it could. The idea is that, well, if the law school just decides, oh, well, for the next 10 years, we're just going to kind of not invest in the factory and we're going to run it into the ground and just extract all the profits we can, that creates kind of an unfair field of competition for other macaroni companies who will be undercut by the NYU pasta because they are kind of thinking about maintaining their factory. So there's an infringement in both directions, right? Into the nonprofit, but also the nonprofit into the for-profit that spoils the kind of what the competitive for-profit space is supposed to look like. Yeah. Do you want to follow up?
This is a hypothetical, and it kind of gets into the NYU as a real estate
Yeah.
entity. But would it then be appropriate if they had this macaroni factory and then instead of selling the profits externally, just sold it to NYU law students for $10
You're
a
thinking,
box?
you got it. You're ready. You could. This is exactly what they end up doing in the 1980s. I mentioned that healthcare merger between the sisters and HCA Healthcare. We can get around this is, go to the legislature and ask for these kind of new entities that are intermediaries that could kind of carry the tax credits and the assets, but kind of help us blur, that language, those institutions. I also want to, sorry, this is a bit random. I wanted to mention, as I was looking into this, that, universities now, I'm not sure what that case would look like today. I'm not sure. And one of the things that's happened at state universities is they have incorporated aspects of their athletics departments as for-profit entities, right? So like the University of Alabama, their football team is run by a for-profit entity, which then generates money for the state university system. So we're in a new, I mean, that's another kind of for-profit, nonprofit blur, but we're kind of, that's where we're at now. Yeah. Please.
I don't know if this falls sort of in the realm of what we're talking about, but
Yeah.
I'm curious on your thoughts about initiatives like impact investments, and if you see that as a solution to, I don't know, make organizations more transparent, and whether you think it's more a trend or something that the industry is shifting towards.
What do you, I'm going to turn the question back on. I have a few thoughts, but I don't know enough about it to have an informed perspective. Do you have a position on this?
I'm skeptical.
You're skeptical. Okay, me too, yeah. I guess one perspective I could offer is, another thing that's happened since the post-war period is the time horizon for all these institutions has shrunk. And, I think that's worrisome. So I'm sure impact investing is a much broader phenomenon that I'm aware of, but it seems to me impact, the kind of very language of impact emphasizes kind of short-term goals. And there's been a kind of homologous kind of movement towards that direction on the for-profit and nonprofit sides, whereas a kind of longer-term horizon, which oftentimes, not always, oftentimes is kind of necessary for impact in maybe the true or real sense of the word, can receive short shrift from that kind of ideology, I would call it. But
they were free and you could go there and get, whatever kind of child care or whatever. But now they don't have them anymore because they weren't productive. And there has to be a feasibility because you have maintenance and upkeep. And if they're not generating any money, and if it's only money that's coming from the fiduciary, that they're not going to last. So we don't have public health centers anymore that are run by the city.
it sounds like an important example.
We have a couple of online questions. The first one being, given the blurring line, how important today is the tax designation, nonprofit, for-profit, for corporate strategy and form? I.e., is the tax distinction simply a state legacy or an apparent vestige that has been creatively repurposed for a new regime of accumulation?
I think creatively repurposed for a new regime of accumulation is a much better way that I was able to, to put it. I think the state, when you get to the level of states, it looks a little bit different. But since the 1980s, the way federal income tax law has developed is that sort of nonprofit status and also tax credits have kind of been, what's the right word, unattached from the legal and institutional forms. So you can trade them, they move, you can combine them, you can recombine them. And so yes, it seems to be, you have a regime that, for better or for worse, was set up for a kind of prior era in which the world looked a certain way. And as the world no longer looks like that, and sort of rethinking what kind of regime you'd like to have, instead, actors within the new world have creatively appropriated, recycled, reused, oftentimes quite cynically, kind of older legal regulations and logics towards kind of new ends. Their own ends, I should say. That seems to me to be a pretty good description of what's happened.
I'll ask one final question.
Please do.
Do you think the educational system can withstand a sanction on its status by the state, as some public goods may be considered more valuable than others, and perhaps overstepping perceived public good? Are there samples in the past of this happening, or this is what we're seeing now?
What was the first part of the question? I'm sorry, I just didn't hear it.
Do you think the educational system can withstand a sanction on its status by the state?
Yeah, look, the kind of public-private dimensions of education and that history and the waxing and waning of perceptions about to what degree education is a public good or not. There's a long history there. The kind of financialization narrative. I talked about nonprofit, but one could have also talked about kind of privatization narrative. And it seems like, since a kind of post-war moment, which was a high point for public education, that in the kind of coeval with the period of financialization has been privatization of education and a kind of loss of sight of the public dimensions of education. But that's true. But can it withstand? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there are plenty of resources within American politics, culture, society to reimagine and rethink the public dimensions of education and to defend them and to renew them. And we're clearly at a moment of crisis in higher education. The meaning of higher education, its relationship to politics and its relationship to wealth. And crises are scary, but they also open things up and create potential for things to change in bad ways, but also, let's hope, good ways too. Okay, good. Thank you very much.